All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to all of you to Collegeville Connections. This is our series of online events presented by the Collegeville Institute, which is located on the campus of St. John's University and St. John's Abbey in central Minnesota. This series of Collegeville Connections highlights the work of Institute alums and friends from across the spectrum of Collegeville Institute programming, and it provides an opportunity for new guests, program alums, and friends of the Institute to stay connected to each other and to this place. And we're especially eager for you to learn from our remarkable guests, and we have two of them here with us today. My name is Jessie Bazan. I'm the Program Associate for the Call to Lives of Meaning and Purpose Initiative. And before I introduce Bill and Lydia, I just want to cover a few technical logistics. So this Zoom webinar is also currently streaming on the Collegeville Institute Facebook page. So if for any reason you get booted off Zoom, feel free to head over to the Collegeville Institute page and you can watch the presentation there. We'll have a chance for questions and answers with our guests at the end of the hour. So if any questions arise during the presentation, feel free to pop those in the Q&A button down below. You'll see that Q&A. You can put your questions right in there. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, feel free to put any questions in the comment section, and I'll be sure to get those to my colleague and our moderator, Stina Kielsmeyer-Cook. So today we have the real honor of hearing from Lydia Wylie-Kellermann and Bill Wylie-Kellermann. Lydia is the editor of the Sandbox Revolution, Raising Kids for a Just World, which calls upon our collective parenting wisdom to wrestle with questions, navigate the challenges, offer concrete practices, and remind parents of the real sacredness of their work. It's written by parents who are also writers, pastors, teachers, organizers, artists, gardeners, and activists. This anthology offers a diversity of voices and experiences on topics that include education, money, anti-racism, resistance, spirituality, disability justice, and earth care. Lydia herself is a writer, activist, and mother in Detroit, Michigan. She's the editor of G's magazine, which sits at the intersection of art, activism, and faith. And in 2014, she participated in the Collegeville Institute Summer Writing Workshop, Writing to Change the World. And her father, Bill, is also a writing workshop alumni, as well as nonviolent community activist, author, teacher, and retired United Methodist pastor, most recently serving at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Detroit. So Bill is author of, most recently, of Celebrant's Flame, Daniel Berrigan in Memory and Reflection. And he also contributed a chapter to the Sandbox Revolution, which is what we're going to discuss today. So thanks again, Bill and Lydia, for being with us. We're so glad to have you to lead us through this conversation. And now I'm going to turn the moderation over to my colleague, Stina Kielsmeyer-Cook.
Thanks so much, Jessie, and welcome to you, Lydia and Bill. Before we kind of jump into reading some excerpts from the Sandbox Revolution, which if you all who are watching this haven't picked up a copy, you should please go purchase a copy. There's links to where you can find it online on our website. It's an excellent anthology. I wanted to ask Lydia, what kind of prompted you to write this book or edit and compile this book?
I pulled together the book because I needed it. I think I first started dreaming about this book in the very early moments of parenting when I was pretty exhausted and lonely, where I was looking out in my neighborhood and the world and feeling fear and so many just sort of deep questions about what was the relationship between the world and parenting, and how do I love my kids in a way that helps them love the world. And I had a hunger to ask those questions in community. I think that there's a way in which a lot of these questions around parenting are so personal but yet they live in a web of systemic realities. They are political in nature as well. Questions about where do our kids go to school? How do we think about money? Where do we live? All of those questions are questions of justice and deeply personal questions that take place in our family. And I think because they're personal, they're so often kept private. But I think we also have a hunger to name them more out loud, to ask those questions in community, and being able to do that vulnerably offers space for imagination and for courage. And I needed that. So I was really grateful to be able to pull together these 16 incredible contributors and pull together this book that focused in 3 ways. And the first section is on nitty-gritty decisions as radical practice. So those are things like money and school and where we live and how we think about spirituality. And the second is resisting the isms that sneak into our family. So how do we resist white supremacy and patriarchy? How do we think about climate justice and disability justice? And the last is on reclaiming community, because I do think that's sort of underneath it all, is how do we let ourselves be held in the deep and loving arms of community.
Oh, I love that answer, and what a gift to community to have this now, to be able to read with friends and neighbors and fellow parents. I'm curious, the book has been out, I guess it was launched in March, right? From
Mm-hmm.
Broadleaf Press. What has been the reception? What has the reception been like so far? Has anything kind of surprised you? This is your first book, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm still learning so much of that. It's still coming out, but I think what I've been most surprised by is just how hungry people are for it. And I think a lot about the sort of mystery of time in the world of publishing, that you don't know the moment that your book's going to land out in the world. We had sent our final drafts of chapters to the publisher like a week before the pandemic started shutting everything down. And it was like, this has changed everything for parents. How do we not include this in the book? And then I was doing final proofing edits right after George Floyd was killed and resistance was rising up, and it felt like, how can this not be in the book? And same thing in January when white supremacists stormed the Capitol again. It was, how can this not be in the book? And so I think we don't ever know when the words are going to arrive, but I think the moment that it is landing in parents' hands is a moment when they're really tired, that this has been sort of such an unbelievably exhausting stretch where we've had to do a lot more without community than we're used to. And I think folks are really tired. And so I keep hearing, and it's so nice to hear folks say, like, I found some companions right when I needed them. And that's really my hope for the book. So I'm glad for that.
Well, I would love to hear some of your writing in the book. So I'm wondering if we can maybe hear an excerpt. Would you read something from the Sandbox Revolution?
Sure. I'll read a little bit from the introduction, which starts with sort of a series of stories and questions from my own kids. A bunny funeral. Last summer, a pile of freshly dug dirt lay next to the hole in our backyard. My younger son, Cedar, then 3, picked up the furry body of his beloved rabbit he had named Raccoon. He cuddled the stiff body in his arms as if it were a baby. He walked slowly around the circle of gathered family and neighbors, stopping to let each person say goodbye and pet Raccoon one last time. Then, with tears in his eyes, Cedar laid the body in the hole. I stood under our grapevines with an aching heart for my boy. I was amazed at the sacred spirit he could hold and the tears that flowed freely. And I wondered, how can those of us who love him, nurture spaces that allow him as he grows to keep touching death and grief in a culture that tries to push death out of sight? How can we make sure he always feels freedom to cry and act tenderly? How can I resist the toxic masculinity that will be thrust upon him from every direction as he gets older? Hiding from bears. It was just weeks into preschool when I picked up Isaac, my older son, from school. We piled into the car and buckled boosters and car seats as Isaac blurted out stories from his day. Mommy, today at school we had to lock the doors and all hide in the bathroom and be really quiet. Oh yeah, why did you have to do that? In case a bear comes and wants to eat us. Isaac had been told that lockdown drills were to protect him from bloodthirsty bears lurking around southwest Detroit. I didn't envy his teacher's job. How else do you explain to a 4-year-old that our country cares more about money and owning guns than it does about the lives of our children? Now at 7, Isaac is taught to hide quietly from bad guys with guns. How on earth do we parent in an age when gun violence is so rampant in this country? How do we work to let our kids feel safe enough to grow and learn? How do we offer different narratives from bad guys with guns? How do we foster spaces where security is dependent on community, trust, and nonviolence, rather than armed security guards and metal detectors? Ultrasound anxiety. Before either of these beloved children were born, I sat in the ultrasound room, not once but twice, with goop on my belly and anxiety in my heart. I was shocked that I would be the mother of 2 boys. I never doubted for a second that I would love them, but I doubted my ability to be any good at it. I felt completely unprepared. I had been ready to raise powerful, smart, spirit-driven, feminist girls, but boys? And I was thrown off by my reaction because I do believe that gender is a social construct, so why the feelings of fear and insecurity? The reality forced me to ask, what does it mean to raise 2 white boys in a world seeping with patriarchy and white supremacy? How will I teach them to take up less space, to listen first and deeply, and to trust the leadership of women and people of color? And on the other hand, how will I tend to their spirits and encourage them to be fully human in a system that threatens to destroy their souls? How will I invite them into the work of smashing this system and loving the hard work of resistance that will liberate us all? Roots of the maple. Those early fears are hard to remember as I stand in awe of the beautiful boys before me. On a recent spring day, I felt the warm dirt in my fingers as I readied the soil for baby kale and broccoli plants. As I worked, I watched Isaac a few beds away. He'd found a maple seedling growing where the tomatoes would soon dwell. He knew the little tree couldn't stay there, but he couldn't bear to pull it out and throw it in the compost. He spent more than an hour in total concentration, gently pulling the dirt away from the roots, which already reached down a full foot. At last, he tenderly pulled out the tree with every root intact. He moved it by an old stump where Grandpa thought it would be safe. He put the little tree back in the earth and watered her roots. The love this kid has for the earth and her creatures melts my heart. I hold on to that love as I scroll through scientific studies that predict human extinction, perhaps even in my children's lifetime. That reality can knock the wind out of me. How do we raise kids who may very well see massive death and destruction of creatures, people, and the environment? What skills will they need? How do we help them keep loving and living in communion with trees and the earthworms? How do we do anything but weep? I have so many questions that ache deep in my being. The answers to these questions are little and big, personal and systemic, and they impact the generations to come. I needed to know that there were more people out there struggling with these questions. I needed stories that could offer company, wisdom, and truth in places I could not see. So I began this most selfish of projects. I reached out to parents and grandparents who I love and whose lives have inspired my footsteps. And I said, tell me some stories. Speak vulnerably. Help remind us of the wide community of which we are all a part. And that is how this book you hold in your hands came to be. With a love for this world and a commitment to the future, parenting becomes a radical act of resistance and hope.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lydia. I'm so glad to be not only part of this wider conversation, but to be part of the conversation that the book is. And I'm thinking the extent to which it's an active community, and the way in which you pulled together folks some of whom I know well and work with here in Detroit in movement work, or others at a distance, and some folks completely new to me, and actually sort of embodied the preparations for the book in a retreat. Not only of friends, but folks totally new. And I'm wondering if you would say something about the dimensions and intersections and the kinds of voices that you were trying to take into account and have be present in the volume. And do you feel you succeeded with that?
Such a good and hard question, and one that I took really seriously, and I hope that we all together as a community took really seriously in the creation of the book. As we've said, the contributors themselves are writers and organizers and pastors, farmers, healers, musicians, storytellers, teachers, activists. There's young parents and old parents, some who are carrying children in utero and others who have grandkids. There's fathers and mothers and queer parents and white parents, Black parents, Asian parents, Latino parents, Indigenous parents. And I think it's a pretty incredible and beautiful, diverse group of writers. And I'm so grateful for each of them. But then I also think there's another sense in which we can sort of never truly succeed at that as well. I've laid awake many nights thinking about the voices that are missing in the book, or of another dozen parents that I would have loved to ask to write. And I think that have to frame that as a gift, that community is wide and justice is wide and parenting journeys are as different as the kids that we raise. And it can't ever all be contained within one book. So I think this book is just one piece of a much wider conversation of stories and voices that just keeps growing.
Because you live so close, I get to see, day-to-day parenting that you do. And one of the things I notice is how much and how often you're writing and journaling constantly and beautifully about Cedar and Isaac. And I wonder how you would name the energy that's beneath that, and how your growth as a writer affects your parenting, and kind of vice versa. What does writing have to do with parenting?
I love that question, and I don't even know. I mean, it's so true, and I don't know if I even would have articulated it if you hadn't asked it out loud. I think that writing is how I slow down. It's how I pay attention. It's how I acknowledge meaning. And in some ways, it's almost like writing is prayer, or a form of prayer. And I have these two kids who are so full of wisdom and ask all these amazing questions and continually teach me about what it means to be human. And there's a lot of chaos too, right? That's just what kind of comes with parenting. And so I think writing is trying to find those cracks in between the chaos to pause, and to find those quiet moments to remember and to honor, to listen. And I think then writing becomes an act of loving them as well, and an act of learning from them, and a reminder of hope. I do think that parenting has made me a better writer too. And I actually remember naming this out loud at the Collegeville Institute, which is now 7 years ago, which is hard to believe. But I was away for a week and I was weaning Isaac, my oldest, at that point. And I remember talking out loud about how breastfeeding had made me a better writer, because I'm usually somebody who writes really fast. And suddenly I had all of this time where I couldn't do anything but think. Like I just held this baby in my hands and I couldn't do anything. And so I'd end up thinking and I'd end up starting to write, but I could only write as much as I could remember. So it might be that I spent 20 minutes writing one sentence. And that slowed my writing down in a way that suddenly I was thinking more about words and the crafting and how much you could say in one sentence. And I think parenting offers so many moments like that, where it's like, I'm going to stare at this earthworm with you for a whole hour, or I'm going to do dishes or laundry or rub your back at night. And there are these sort of different kinds of time than we're used to. It's not the same as sort of productivity or time scarcity. It's like, I'm just in this. And there's a different kind of time and writing that can be done in those spaces.
That's great, Lydia. I identify with that too as a parent and writer. Do you have any other questions for Lydia at this point, Bill? Or if not, I would love to invite you to do some reading as well.
Yeah, okay. Is that a good time for me to read something?
Yes, yes. So I know that you contributed a chapter to the anthology, and I just think it's so beautiful that to have an intergenerational, to have your parent, Lydia, contributing to the book. So yes, please, Bill, we'd love to invite you to read from that. And then Lydia, if you have any questions for Bill afterwards, I'm going to go ahead and go off camera so we can just see the two of you.
Great. Yeah, thanks. I think what I'll read is from the beginning of my reflection, and I'm choosing it partly because it has two voices, both my own and my wife Genie Wylie has a solid word in it as well. The seriousness of baptism. But don't you need your dad's permission to go? It was a joke line rooted in this father's fear. Her mother gone to God a few years prior. My daughter Lydia, a college senior, was attending a Michigan peace team training for a nonviolent war zone presence in the West Bank, Palestine. She would know the taste of tear gas and the high screech and body-rocking thud of sound bombs. In those days, the Israeli Defense Forces were forbidden the use of live ammunition in the presence of internationals, a distinction practically without a difference, though settler snipers knew no such restriction. She would sleep some nights in a shepherd's cave and accompany young boys to their flocks beneath the illegal settlements occupying the hills above. In Belene, she would join a group of villagers trying to resist the wall under construction, which hemmed them in, cut them off from waters, their olive trees. Though nonviolent and creative, their efforts were met each week with gas and bullets, regular casualties to be expected. My heart quickly took the measure. To my question about permission, a permission slip, Lydia replied, "You already gave me your permission. You baptized me." It was a stunning joke line in return, one rooted in faith, and also one that we'd not so inadvertently taught. Baptizing an infant in arms is a celebration that says to the child, "You are loved by God, you are surrounded with love and care. As a pure act of grace, you are already part of this beloved community. And there's not a thing you can do about it either way. It just is a gift." But here's the caveat. We now commend you to the way of discipleship, the path of risky and costly grace. Take up your cross and follow Jesus. Is that a formula for bad parenting, a contradiction, or a paradox? One not need be a Christian to embrace this particular paradox. Folks of other faith traditions, and even none at all, must struggle with the tension of wanting children to know they are safe and loved, but also raise them up with ethical values that challenge authority with all the risks inherent. It is, however, the biblical tradition out of which our family and community lives. In 1986, Genie Wylie, my wife of beloved memory, expressed this paradox as a reluctance to baptize our daughter. In what's become something of an iconic article in our circle, She poured out her soul for the local Catholic worker paper on the edge. Here's her voice. I didn't want to baptize Lydia. My love for her took me off guard. I'd only been able to see her and touch her for a few hours, and already I wanted the world for her. I studied her while she lay in my arms to eat, and she stared back. I cried often. I was overwhelmed. In a quick, constrictive moment, I wanted to draw a circle in the dirt around Bill and Lydia and me. I envisioned a brick tower rising on the circle and securing us from intrusions, which might not honor the bond of love and satisfaction that held us together. I never wanted her to hurt. I cried when she cried. In the flesh of raging feelings which came with the afterbirth, I became anxious and impatient if nothing could be done to calm my child. Having entertained the thought, even if she dies tomorrow, it will all have been worth it just to know her, I was suddenly terrified that she would die, leaving a void like my father had when I was 17, sacrificed on an altar to a God who routinely asks too much. I was simultaneously struck by the magnificence of what God could create and singularly disinterested in hearing the voice of that God again. And then came the question of baptism, water, words, community, offering our child back to God. We would give her to a God who models the cross. We would invite her to listen for a voice calling in the night, to vigil, to put herself at risk, to leave family and friends, to speak clearly a truth for which one can be executed. We would thereby invite her into the risks we have already elected and by God's grace will continue to elect to take with our own lives. In the act of baptism, we would wash away the possibility that our concern for her might justify a diminishing of our own obedience to our Lord's perverse ethic of vulnerability and gain through loss. I know exactly what she was talking about. As parents, we make decisions every day. Where do we choose to live? Where do our kids go to school? How do we show up in the street when our community or others are under attack? To stand on the side of justice often means that we have to take some risks. Some of these are modest, others momentous. None are easy. They can be fraught with angst, uncertainty, second guessing. We worry about our kids, but we also worry about what they will learn if we don't act. These risks are made lighter when we face them as community. Who helps us discern? Who holds us accountable? Who holds our children as we get dragged off to jail? It was community that made these workable options for us, which is to say, it was community that finally made possible the decision to bring Lydia into the waters.
Thanks, Dad. And thanks for bringing Mom's voice into it too. I guess one question that I have for you and has sort of always been helpful for me to hear you articulate. We talk a lot in Detroit. We ask Grace Boggs this question, what time is it on the clock of the world? And I wonder right now, for you as an elder and as a grandparent, what do you think, what time is it on the clock of the world right now? And what are the fears and hopes that you carry in this moment?
Yeah. In some ways, I've always thought of time as less a clock matter. So I loved Grace's question and her asking us to think about the present moment, but as more in the New Testament sense of kairos, and the way in which in a crisis there's both danger and opportunity present, as in the Chinese character that represents that. To read the clock of the world through your grandchildren is to see them on the brink of the future. It has to do with what you see coming in this moment, and also the resources that you see them having to face that, and it's sort of in how you pray them forward. And I'm aware that COVID is not the big crisis, but actually one of many, a cascade of crises that are coming. The degradation of the planet and the fragileness in a way of the global technological systems that seem to hold things together but are on the brink of not. And the fears that come with ecological collapse, which are kind of a shadow across everything, spawning oil wars and water wars already in the present moment. Those fears and that body of fear can be so readily manipulated as they have been in these recent years into a rage of white supremacy and fascism. So those are part of the moment, what time it is, and at the same time, I'm seeing in the present moment the hopefulness of a stunning, really stunning new generation of young people launching movements for Black lives and for climate justice and sanity, for immigrant welcoming. And it's exhilarating to see my grandchildren walking in those marches or being pushed in strollers sometimes, and to see the gifts that they're sort of who they're growing into, and to imagine them in as active agents in that future.
Mm-hmm. I think that, you know, this year has been an awakening for a lot of folks, that I think a lot of folks are feeling sort of what time is it on the clock of the world in a different way, and more folks sort of yearning to figure out how to join in movement, and particularly how to do that with family and with kids. And I wonder how you would sort of encourage folks who might be new to the work of activism to enter into that work.
In my own experience, I think both mentors and community have been sort of essential to my taking steps and stepping into the flow of movement. I was actually blessed to be taken under the wing by movement elders who made themselves available to me and offered guidance. I don't know if that's something you can actually seek out. I think some people do. Or in my case, I was just kind of in the right place at the right time and stumbled into them providentially. Community, on the other hand, is worth seeking and building, and it is work. There are solitary witnesses of conscience, but it's rare. Community is so important to building up one another's courage, in discerning risks and the way forward, and sometimes providing a measure of economic freedom even, and flexibility to be able to act, and certainly in sharing the gifts and work of child rearing. I think activist parenting and with community support changes everything.
Yeah, I agree. And I think too about that question you're raising about elders and seeking them out, but also just the gift you had in terms of elders sort of feeling that as part of their vocation of being available. And that is something that I see in you, and I'm really grateful for. It's just your ability to be open and available. And I think of, all the elders who are in this book, who really have sort of laid their hands and been available to a younger generation. And I have a lot of gratitude for that. I am mindful that today is your birthday, and so that often makes me think about your mom and my grandma as well. And I think that there's a lot of ways in this book where part of the work is looking back on the ways that all of us were raised, and some of that's with really amazing gratitude, and some of that is also thinking about the trauma and the lessons that we need to unlearn as part of our own parenting journeys. But I wonder how you think about your mom today, and what lessons in community and faith and justice you might be holding.
That's not actually a question I've thought a lot about, and I appreciate it partly for that reason. My mom was a homemaker and not really an activist, active church person, at least not an activist in my growing up time. Her college degree was actually in home economics, and she married a pastor, and she was a great cook and a really loving mom for five boys. Really, I think she also was wishing for at least some girls in the mix. But she spread a wonderful table for family and friends, and had a real gift for the ministry of hospitality. When I was young, like early elementary school, my dad served a church in Flint, Michigan, and the church was close to the railroad tracks. So close to the Chevy plant, actually, and the railroad tracks running there. And so men would ride the rails in looking for work, or and end up knocking on the parsonage door for help. And so my mom was constantly making sandwiches and feeding people, at our house. And that's a vivid memory of sort of a proto hospitality. My youngest brother was heading off to college, and I was in seminary. That's actually the point where she suddenly was able to flex her wings a little bit. She ended up on the national board of the church, Methodist Church, in the women's division, which is actually the most radical of the parts of the church in many ways. So suddenly she was reading liberation theology and being at table with global church leaders. And I think it actually kind of freaked out my dad a little bit that she was growing in this way. And after Genie and I, and my brother Jimmy, all of us had gone on Witness for Peace delegations to Nicaragua during the Contra War, my mom decided she was going, and she signed up, and my dad put his foot down and said this was not happening. And I think, part of it was, a worry for her safety, which is legitimate, but also just being scared at the way she was growing far beyond being a good homemaker. And I'm kind of wondering, as you ask, how how her inner urges and yearning and pulls were already present and, part of what I was learning, even to the extent that they were contained and suppressed,
Mm-hmm.
kind of indirect,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wish I could sit down with her now, because both Erin and I are surrounded by sisters, and she really did raise four incredible men who are really gentle and loving, and I'm grateful are in the lives of my kids. But I'd love to know how she did it.
Yeah. Mm.
I love thinking back on the generations, and this is just a beautiful reflection of that, of yeah, how we've been shaped by who's come before us. And I just have to ask, I know you guys live on the same block in Detroit, you guys are in community with one another, and yet it can be a really different experience to read something that your father or your daughter has written. It's just a different way of communicating. And I was just curious, Lydia, as the editor of this anthology and having your dad, who has been an author of many books, what was it like to, even just now hearing him read about your baptism and about his worry for you? What was that like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I have so much gratitude for the way that both my parents raised my sister and I. And I feel so lucky that I can work on a book on parenting and ask my dad to write or to be in spaces like this together. I think it was really interesting to read the chapter, kind of putting himself into those worries that he was holding in those moments. And there's this sort of constant mantra through his chapter that sort of along every sort of decision is asking, is this a gift or is it too much to ask? And I feel that in myself as a parent, and I think a lot of us do, of like a really hard balance to know when are risks too much, how much are we, when do we start harming our kids? And but it's also kind of interesting to be able to read that chapter now looking back and saying you can actually sort of answer some of those questions in terms of how it turned out in this case. And I mean, I just every step of those, every one of those decisions, I just have so much gratitude for, and I'd come down on the fact that it was just gift time after time. And I'm really glad for the hard choices and the risks that both of you took. And I feel the way that it echoes in my bones, and I see the way that it pours out on my kids, and I'm just really grateful for it.
Yeah, there was a time when Lydia was known as Genie and Bill Wylie-Kellermann's daughter, and I'm coming into the age when I'm being identified and recognized as Lydia Wylie-Kellermann's dad. And in a similar flip script, I think really one of my best teachers. There are all kinds of ways in which your kids teach you in their growing up how to parent, but to have them, as both Lydia and Lucy are, really come into the fullness of their humanity and vocations, and to be taught in that process again by them is a great gift. Genie was she was a journalist and a author and a filmmaker and a magazine editor, all those things, and she was my editor more than once, which we could bump heads over sometimes. So to be edited by Lydia, both in this book and now also in G's magazine, which is such a weird echo of Genie doing the Witness magazine here in Detroit, and so similar in some ways, and to see so much of her in the way your vocation is flourishing, there's a great joy.
I'm really struck by that paradox of faith, of taking up your cross to follow Jesus, and also passing faith to our children, which can then put them in those places of having to suffer in some ways. And you write about that so well, Bill, in your anecdote about Lydia going to the West Bank. And it seems from what you're saying, Lydia, that it really, case by case, in your case, it turned out well, right? And yet in every instance, we have to discern as parents, each situation is different, each situation is new. How do you encourage, or can you point parents towards discernment practices that have worked for you in deciding when and how to live out your faith as it puts children in places where there might be suffering?
Hmm. Is that to me or Lydia?
Whoever wants to take it. I think initially to you, Bill.
Well, actually, I'm thinking that the backstory to her experience in going to Palestine was that when she was 4, Genie and I went to Israel, Palestine, and to Gaza. It was during the second Intifada, and we dropped her off at her Grandma B's in the Upper Peninsula, and actually on the way home, I was the one that dropped her off. On the way home, I took out a tape recorder and tried to say in the simplest language why we were doing what we were doing, in case there would be some, fatal accident, which goes with international travel, but especially in a war zone. And Gaza and the West Bank were not then the bombed out rubble they are these days, but it was still risky. So I took out this tape recorder and kind of recorded in the simplest language I could why we were doing what we were doing, and why it was important. I don't know how it would have played in her young psyche if she'd actually come to need it, but it's still in a box of books and dolls and things up in the attic. I sometimes wondered if she'd have to play it for a therapist one day. But the choice of going, involved, in that case, involved leaving her behind, and the risks of that she suffered without even being aware of it, enjoying a time with her Grandma B.
I think about a couple things. I mean, one again is just coming back to community and having circles you can ask those questions out loud with. I think of circles all throughout our life that we've depended on at different moments around resistance. And I mean, some of those are, when you're planning protests or actions and you're doing nonviolence training together and you're thinking about actions and you're listening really deeply to what people's needs are, and you're trusting people to act in the ways that they need to act, and that those situations are all different for each of us. And so how do we trust one another and ask those questions together? And we did similar things when my mom was dying, and we were making medical decisions, and some of those were really countercultural decisions to what was, what Western science would have said we needed to do, or what the funeral industry would have said we needed to do. And again, it was how are we a little bit braver and able to do a little bit more creative things if we have a community to help ask some of these questions. And then the other thing I think does lean on what my dad was just saying about sort of truth telling to kids. I mean, my parents were consistently really good at talking to us about injustice in the world. And I think there's a lot of different opinions about that, about how much to sort of let kids be kids and how much to say, here's what's going on in the world. And my parents were really good at finding words to explain things to us, so that when we were going to protest or doing work, we were always felt like we were part of it, that we mattered in the work. that it was our choice and we felt like it was important. And I think that actually there are ways that our kids can help us discern too. So it's like if we're going to a protest and we want to make, some decision, we can ask our kids, how do they feel about it? And sometimes it's like, yeah, it's really important, we need to do that. And sometimes kids are like, I can't, like, I'm scared. And then we honor that and we listen to that. And how do we discern together with our kids is really important, I think.
That kind of leads into a Q&A question that talks about anxiety. So many children struggle with anxiety. How can we take this into account as we strive to parent in more radical ways, which includes having some of these frank and hard conversations?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a hard, like, it has to be based on sort of knowing who the kid is and trusting our kid. And I think sometimes anxiety around the world can actually help by taking more radical action. That I think when you feel like you're part of a community, when you're part of action, when there's things you can do, there's hope, you see large scale actions happening, that I think there's a way in which that can actually reduce some anxiety too. That it's what sort of can give us fuel and energy for the daily work. But I also really do think that we need to trust our kids and to be able to love them where they're at and be gentle. It's just sort of that tension that I think we live in as parents. And I think, yeah, I do think that, again, coming back to community, sort of offering kids multiple voices and multiple adults to lean on who see things in different ways and can talk to kids in different ways and might see the world a little bit differently, can be a big help too. But I feel that a lot with my 8-year-old right now, who's just like, climate change is like so deep in his heart. And yeah, the pain is, I mean, there are moments where I'm like, this is too much, but also honoring his pain and love, and how do we as a family move deeper into that work out of his heart and conscience.
Another question from the Q&A. Bill, what jumps out to you as the biggest and newest challenge for raising the next generation compared to when you were raising Lydia?
Biggest challenge?
Yeah, biggest or newest challenge.
Good question. I don't have a quick answer that comes to mind. It seems like the big challenge is, at least for child rearing, is, as Lydia was just saying, for children to have a sense of their agency. And I think not to yield to this connects with the last question as well, not to yield to the temptation of denial, which is so endemic in American culture. You know, death is like underneath everything in land theft and labor theft and the history of war and violence, that we tend to cover it over. And the anxiety, I think, that we all feel, and children pick up as well, right? The temptation is to sort of cover over it again, but that's the endemic US American problem, in fact. And so finding ways, I think the big challenge is finding ways to be honest and truthful with kids, and to give them a sense of their own agency and subjectivity in family and even in your community and city and history.
I'll name one other thought that I think you didn't have to deal with, that I think is a lot different, is the role of social media, in that, like, parenting has become so public in another way, and like there's so much work on like showing the perfect family, and there's a lot of like judgment about how you're doing it as a parent, and
Sure.
a lot of like, what's the right way to do things. And I think that's something that we really struggle with, and was like really clear in my book that I wanted to make sure we avoided, was like, there's no judgment, you're doing enough. There's no right way. There's a million ways to do all of these things, but there's company and there's grace and there's vulnerability, and we trust one another on our journeys, because I think that is something that is very different for parents in this generation than you had in a lot of ways.
It seems like to parent towards justice really does require this communal investment. I keep hearing that theme over and over. And I think that the typical American family really doesn't have that kind of investment. So I'm curious if you have any advice or encouragement for people who are parenting and looking for that kind of community. What are ways that they can take a first step?
Yeah, again, I think it can be done in a million different ways. I think in some ways about how we define family, and and sort of the limits and problems of the nuclear family in multiple ways, and sort of an invitation to be imaginative and creative outside of that. I sometimes think about how my kids have 4 grandmothers, and I forget very quickly that none of them are related by blood. Like, one is my dad's partner, Denise, and one is my partner's mother. And then we've got two women who didn't have kids and who said, "Can I claim you as grandkids?" And we said, "Yes, can we claim you as grandmother?" And I think there are so many folks hungry for those relationships. And how do we just take the bold decision to claim one another and to broaden family, sort of one way. And then, I mean, I think about our neighborhood, and how the ways in which kids force us to spend a lot of time outside. I think I've gotten to know my neighbors so much better because I'm spending hours outside watching them bike. And on our street, we've got a piano teacher and a baseball coach and puppeteers and pastors and potters and a bakery and teachers and elders who were born on the street. And what a gift that is to my kids to know these folks and to be able to learn things that I could never teach them. So a lot of it, I think, is just sort of that sometimes awkward work of getting to know the people who are around us. And I also think there's several, in the book, there's multiple chapters that call on us to think about how sometimes building community means making less money. And that can be sort of a hard thing for us to think about. But if we make less money, we might have more time with our kids or more time in our neighborhoods, that we can think of community as the capital that we're surviving on. And I think about that with resources. It's like, does my block need 20 lawnmowers? No, we don't. And if we don't have a lawnmower and we live on a little bit less, and then we have to ask our neighbor for a lawnmower, that builds community, to be able to name what we need. And, besides also reducing resources, that I think there's that capitalism and individualism doesn't allow us for that sort of creativity. But if we can sort of live on less and need to ask for what we need and share the resources we have, that's another way to build community.
I love that. That's a great answer. Well, there's more questions, but unfortunately we're almost out of time, so I'm gonna have to call it. But I just wanna say thank you so much, Lydia and Bill, for sharing your knowledge and your insight and stories with us. And I just wanna say thank you too to everyone who joined us today, whether here on Zoom or on Facebook Live. I want to invite you to join us for future Collegeville Connections events. Next month on Wednesday, July 7th, same time, from noon to 1 Central Time, you'll have the opportunity to hear from the author, Sophronia Scott. She's a writing coach in our new Emerging Writers Mentorship Program. And she's going to be sharing her deep dive into the journals of the Trappist monk Thomas Merton, which inspired her new book called The Seeker and the Monk. And you can find registration for information for that event at the collegevilleinstitute.org/events. So please register for that if you haven't yet. And thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Lydia and Bill. And we hope to see you at another Collegeville Connections event soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. So great to be here.
All right, take care.